settle into the world of long voyages across frigid northern seas. The creak of wooden hulls, the tang of salt spray, and ice-cold wind greeting roughened faces. On board Viking longships, or more often Nars, their bulky merchant cargo vessels built for endurance, the greatest challenge was not the storm, but staying alive. Surrounded by endless water, fresh food vanished within days and scurvy loomed. Yet the Vikings survived. Their secret was not exotic fruit or stored citrus. It was a diet so pragmatic and odd by modern standards, it seems bizarre. Think dried cod hung on racks in Arctic winds, Whey-Cured meat preserved in sour milk, and porridge made of coarse grain. So how did these northern mariners keep their strength and their skin from tearing into scurvy? What curious staples and preservation methods did they rely on? And what does this say about their adaptability, toughness, and ingenuity? Let's chart their survival plate by plate and discover how necessity shaped a diet both grotesque and brilliant. When a Viking ship prepared to leave harbor, the first concern was not the sail or the oars, but the food. A vessel crossing the North Sea could expect weeks of uncertainty. Storms might force detours. Winds could halt progress for days. No one could predict when the crew would next set foot on land. The cargo, therefore, had to sustain not only the strength of the rowers, but the lives of everyone on board. The staples chosen for these voyages were simple, almost austere. The most important of them all was stockfish, cod caught in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, then hung to dry on great wooden racks until the flesh hardened into slabs of pale, fibrous food. Drying was done not with smoke or salt, but with wind and frost. The cold, steady air of northern Norway or Iceland preserved the fish naturally, removing nearly 3/4 of its water content. The result was light to carry, resistant to decay, and astonishingly durable. Even months later, stockfish remained edible, though only after heavy pounding to soften it, and sometimes soaking to make it chewable. Archaeological finds in northern Norway and Lofoten confirm this practice. Thousands of cod bones, traces of drying racks, and references in later medieval trade records show that this single food became not just a survival ration, but an export economy in itself. Beside the fish, Vikings carried grain. Barley, oats, and rye formed the basis of porridge and bread. Grain could be stored in sacks, carried on Nar cargo ships, and ground as needed with small quernstones. Porridge required little more than water and a fire, resources that could usually be managed even on a ship. The texture was coarse, the flavor plain, but it filled the stomach and restored energy. In many accounts, porridge was eaten morning and night, varied only by the occasional addition of butter, lard, or dried berries. Some sagas reference bread as well, but bread required leavening and careful baking, which were not always possible at sea. Porridge, on the other hand, never failed. Protein beyond fish was supplied through preserved meats. Fresh meat would spoil within days, but Vikings had learned to cure it in whey, the acidic byproduct of skyr, their fermented milk curd. Submerging meat in sour whey prevented bacterial growth, creating a sharp, tangy preservation method that required no salt, which was expensive and not always available in large quantities. Cuts of lamb, goat, or even horse meat could be stored this way and brought aboard. Archaeological traces of whey-soaked meat are rare, but written references in later Icelandic law codes and the sagas describe it as a practical preservation method in the north. Fats were another essential. Butter and lard, carefully packed in sealed containers, provided concentrated calories. They could be added to porridge, spread on bread when available, or used to soften dried fish. Without these fats, a diet of fish and grain alone would have led to malnutrition and weakness. Skeletal remains from Viking Age graves show we're consistent with diets high in fish and dairy, confirming the reliance on these staples. The preparation of supplies was often a communal effort. Families and farms worked together in the months before departure, salting, drying, and fermenting enough food to fill barrels and sacks. Stockfish was strung on racks in late winter, harvested in spring, and ready for voyages by summer. Grain was stored from the last harvest. Butter and skyr were produced steadily from livestock. The community understood that a voyage required more than warriors. It required farmers, herders, and women in the households who preserved and packed the food that made such journeys possible. On board, meals were plain. Stockfish had to be hammered with the blunt side of an axe until it splintered into fibrous strips. These could be chewed as they were, or dipped in water or ale to soften. Porridge was boiled in iron cauldrons when the ship reached shore, or, on larger cargo vessels, cooked in clay-lined hearths set into the deck. Food was rationed carefully. Each man knew that waste could cost lives. Portions were measured, not in generosity but in necessity. The monotony of this diet was extreme. Travelers later described stockfish as tasteless, almost wooden, when eaten day after day. Yet for the Vikings, taste was secondary to endurance. The calories kept muscles working at the oar, eyes open on night watch, and bodies resilient against cold. A meal was judged not by its flavor, but by its ability to hold back weakness. When possible, the diet was supplemented. Near coastal settlements, crews might hunt seabirds, collect eggs, or gather shellfish. Stopping at rivers or fjords, they fished with nets and lines. Supplies could be restocked with fresh grain or dairy when friendly farms or trading posts allowed. But on the open sea, there was no such luxury. What had been packed before departure was what would sustain them. The image of a Viking feast with roasted meats, horns of mead, and laughter around the longhouse fire is well known. But the reality of survival at sea was the opposite. Tough slabs of dried cod, porridge boiled from coarse barley, strips of whey-preserved meat, and the occasional spoon of butter. This was not a diet designed for pleasure. It was a diet designed for survival. By modern standards, it seems strange, even harsh. But for the Vikings, who measured life by endurance and who carried their world across oceans, it was entirely logical. Their provisions reflected their environment, cold, austere, but capable of sustaining life when nothing else could. If dried fish was the backbone of Viking survival, dairy was its hidden lifeline. In the Scandinavian world, where summers were short and winters unforgiving, livestock meant more than meat. Cows, goats, and sheep provided a steady stream of milk that could be transformed, stored, and carried in ways fresh meat could not. This milk became the raw material of skyr, a thick, tangy curd still eaten in Iceland today, and whey, the sour liquid that remained once the curds were drained. Together, they formed a preservation system that may seem peculiar now, but was essential for keeping Vikings alive at sea. Skyr was no luxury food. It was practical, dense with protein, and capable of lasting for months when kept cool. Archaeological remains of dairy vats and churns in Norse farmsteads from Iceland to Denmark confirm its production. Skyr could be eaten fresh, but its true value lay in its durability. Pressed into wooden tubs, sometimes mixed with honey or berries, it provided calories long after fresh supplies had dwindled. For seafarers, it was easy to transport, requiring no elaborate cooking, only a wooden spoon. But the more curious contribution came from the whey. Modern diets often discard it as waste. For the Vikings, it was indispensable. Its acidity acted as a preservative. Meat or fish submerged in whey absorbed its sourness, but resisted decay even without salt. The sagas and later Icelandic law codes reference this method, calling it sursaður kjöt, or soured meat. Archaeological traces are faint. Preserved dairy leaves little evidence, but the practice is consistently attested in written tradition and confirmed by ethnographic parallels in rural Iceland into modern times. To Viking voyagers, whey was both drink and preservative, simultaneously quenching thirst and keeping their limited protein from spoiling. Whey was more than practical chemistry. It was nutrition. The liquid contained lactose, minerals, and small amounts of vitamin C, which may have helped stave off scurvy. In a world where no sailor had access to citrus, these hidden nutrients mattered. Combined with fermented vegetables or the occasional fresh organ meat taken during hunts, the whey-based diet gave Norse sailors a small but critical margin of health. The production of skyr and whey was not the work of warriors. It fell largely to women managing the farmsteads, where milk was transformed into curd and liquid, then stored in wooden barrels, skin bags, or ceramic vessels. seasonal rhythms dictated production. In summer, when pastures were rich, animals produced the most milk, and this was the season of heavy skyr making. By autumn, supplies were salted, soured, or dried for the long dark months to come. When ships set sail, they carried not only the strength of men at the oars, but also the unseen labor of women and the byres and kitchens of distant farms. Without their work, voyages would not have been possible. For children raised on Viking farms, dairy was an everyday taste. Saga references suggest that even young boys training for future raiding expeditions consumed skyr daily, mixed with butter or honey when available. Whey was served as a drink alongside bread or porridge. By the time these children grew into sailors, the flavors of skyr and whey were not unusual but familiar, part of the cultural fabric of survival. To outsiders, such as later European chroniclers, the reliance on soured dairy appeared strange, even distasteful. To the Norse, it was simply common sense. Beyond skyr and whey, other dairy products accompanied voyages. Butter, churned in wooden vessels, was pressed into clay or wooden tubs and sealed with cloth or wax. This butter, yellow and dense, served both as food and as fat for cooking. Archaeological finds in bogs have even revealed preserved butter stored in animal skins, an indication that Vikings relied on ingenious preservation methods. Long before refrigeration, cheese, often hard and salty, also traveled well. Together with skyr, these products created a layered system of dairy preservation that carried the Viking diet through both land and sea. Dairy was not merely food but identity. In the sagas, insults sometimes took the form of mocking a rival's diet, calling a man soft for eating too much dairy, or praising a warrior who endured on little more than curds and fish. This reveals how diet was tied to notions of toughness, endurance, and masculinity. Consuming skyr on a ship was not indulgence, it was proof that one could thrive on the simplest, sourest food, enduring hardship without complaint. There is also evidence of ritual association. In some accounts, milk and dairy were offered to household spirits or gods, connecting food preservation to spiritual protection. Archaeological finds of small vessels with traces of milk fats in burial contexts suggest that dairy carried symbolic as well as practical meaning. To carry skyr or whey on a voyage may have been seen not only as nourishment, but as carrying the blessing of home and farm into the uncertainty of the sea. On board, meals incorporating dairy were simple. A scoop of skyr stirred into porridge thickened the grain and added protein. Whey diluted with water became a tangy drink, refreshing in its sharpness. Meat drawn from whey barrels was eaten cold, its sourness accepted as a fair price for survival. Combined with dried fish and grain, dairy provided variety in texture and ensured that the body did not falter. Modern tastes might find this diet unusual, even unpleasant. But for Vikings, the sour tang of whey, the dense bite of skyr, and the richness of butter were reminders of continuity, of farms left behind, and the endurance of traditions that kept life moving from one season to the next. On the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, such foods did more than feed the body. They anchored the voyagers to the land and people they had left, turning survival rations into cultural lifelines. By the time a ship reached distant shores, Greenland, Ireland, or the rivers of Russia, the men aboard were thinner, their supplies reduced, their palates dulled by repetition. Yet they had endured, carried not by exotic imports, but by curds and whey, products of their own harsh homeland. These foods, bizarre in their sourness and simplicity, were the quiet secret of survival, a bridge between farm and fjord, between the hearth fire and the uncertain sea. For any voyage, water was as necessary as wind. Yet, in the Viking world, carrying it across long distances presented a problem as dangerous as hunger. Fresh water, stored in wooden barrels or animal skin bags, began to sour within days. Bacteria thrived, and the once clear liquid grew foul. For crews at sea, survival depended not only on what they ate, but on what they drank. To endure for weeks or months, Vikings relied on a mixture of fresh water, low-strength ale, and, for the wealthy, small supplies of meat or wine. These drinks were not luxuries but strategies, chosen for endurance rather than pleasure. the most common provision was water stored in barrels. Archaeological finds from Viking ship burials, such as at Oseberg, include staves and hoops from casks, showing that containers were part of standard equipment. Coopered barrels held several gallons each, and larger vessels like the Nar could carry many of them. But water did not stay fresh indefinitely. After a week, it might be tolerable. After 2, it became difficult to drink. By the 3rd or 4th week, if not replenished, it could become a hazard. Sailors knew this, and whenever possible they refilled casks from streams, rivers, or rainwater. During storms, some ships even collected water directly from the sky, spreading sails to funnel the rainfall into barrels. Such improvisations extended supplies, but could not eliminate the problem entirely. The solution, often, was ale. Unlike the strong beers of later centuries, Viking ale was mild, brewed from barley or oats, flavored sometimes with herbs, and containing only a small percentage of alcohol. This was not intended for intoxication but for preservation. Alcohol and the brewing process killed many of the microorganisms that spoiled water, allowing ale to keep longer in casks. For common sailors, ale became the daily drink, consumed in careful portions. It provided calories as well, fermentable sugars and grains, translated into energy that supported the long rhythm of rowing or standing watch. Evidence of Viking brewing is widespread. Residues in pottery, brewing vats, and hearths at settlements such as Hedeby and Jorvik show the use of barley, honey, and sometimes imported flavorings, like hops or bog myrtle. Farmsteads across Scandinavia produced ale for local use, and surplus could be packed aboard ships. Written sources, including Icelandic sagas, describe men drinking ale at feasts and voyages alike, though with recognition of its modest strength. To modern palates, it would have been closer to a light, sour beer or even a fermented porridge, drinkable, filling, but far from refined. Mead, fermented honey, was rarer. Honey was precious, available in small quantities from wild hives or cultivated bees. Mead carried prestige, associated with feasts, poetry, and the gods. The poetic Edda and Havamal mention mead repeatedly, not as daily sustenance, but as a symbol of knowledge, reward, or excess. On voyages, only the wealthiest or most symbolic expeditions could afford to carry mead. Small casks might have accompanied chieftains, reserved for rituals or to mark a successful landfall, but it was not a drink for ordinary endurance. Wine was rarer still, an import from the south. Archaeological finds of amphora fragments in Viking trading towns suggest that wine entered Scandinavia through commerce with the Carolingian world and beyond, but its cost ensured that only leaders or the wealthy elite tasted it, and almost never at sea. To rely on wine for sustenance would have been unthinkable. The interplay of water and ale shaped the rhythm of life aboard ship. At dawn, men might receive a ration of porridge washed down with thin ale. Midday, stockfish or sour meat, eaten with water if it was still good, or more ale if not. By evening, another ration, and perhaps a sip of something stronger if fortune allowed. These patterns ensured hydration, though never without discomfort. The sourness of ale, the flatness of old water, the monotony of repetition, all were endured because they preserved life. Beyond physical survival, drink carried social weight. Feasting traditions on land elevated the sharing of ale or mead into a ritual of hospitality. Even at sea, sagas suggest that the distribution of drink was a moment of order, reinforcing hierarchy and camaraderie. The man who poured the ale, the leader who decided when casks were opened, exercised authority as much as the helmsman guiding the ship. Drink was sustenance, but it was also structure. Hydration also reveals the limits of Viking endurance. Long voyages demanded discipline not only in rowing but in rationing. Too much ale consumed early risked, leaving barrels empty before land was sighted. Too much water wasted risked sickness. To balance these competing dangers required judgment. Archaeologists studying residues in casks and amphorae from Viking sites note the careful sealing with pitch or wax, attempts to extend freshness by controlling air exposure. These small details remind us that the Viking voyages were not reckless charges into the unknown, but carefully managed exercises in logistics, where even drink was measured. To modern eyes, It may seem strange that a people braving icy seas carried ale as a primary drink, yet this practice was not unique to Scandinavia. Medieval sailors across Europe adopted similar habits, substituting small beer for water. The Vikings simply adapted this method earlier, and more rigorously, because their environment demanded it. Without ale, voyages might have faltered within weeks. With it, men endured, rowing, navigating, and raiding far from home. When we imagine Vikings raising horns of mead in their longhouses, we see ritual and celebration. But when we imagine them on the open sea, the reality is plainer. Barrels of water growing stale, casks of ale rationed carefully, and the steady discipline of men who drank not for pleasure, but because without it, survival was impossible. When we picture Viking food, it is easy to imagine roasts turning on spits, or feasts with whole animals laid out before a hall of warriors. At sea, however, the reality was very different. Provisions were chosen not for ceremony, but for endurance. What could survive weeks without rotting? What could be carried in bulk without overwhelming the ship's storage? The answers, sometimes ingenious and sometimes unsettling, reveal a side of Viking diet that seems strange to modern eyes. Meat remained part of the rations, but rarely in familiar form. Fresh cuts could not endure the salt spray and the shifting temperatures of an ocean voyage. Preservation was essential. Beyond the whey-pickled meats described earlier, Vikings relied on a variety of methods. Salted pork and dried mutton were common, though salt was costly in Scandinavia. Where salt was scarce, other methods filled the gap. Archaeological evidence from Norse farmsteads in Iceland and Greenland indicates that meat was sometimes smoked in low fires and stored in skin bags or barrels. The smoky tang was not sought for flavor, but for longevity. The most unusual method, though only sporadically recorded, involved using the byproducts of everyday life as preservatives. Some later accounts and fragmentary references in folk tradition suggest that Vikings may have experimented with urine for its ammonia content, which acted as a disinfectant. Fish soaked in it could, at least in theory, resist bacterial growth. The archaeological record is silent on this point, and scholars debate whether the practice was common or marginal. But the persistence of the story indicates that the Norse were willing to try unconventional means if it meant food lasted longer at sea. Whale and seal meat also entered the diet, particularly in northern settlements like Greenland and the Faroes. Evidence from middens, refuse heaps, shows bones of marine mammals split and boiled, suggesting that flesh and fat were consumed and stored. Seal meat, when dried, provided dense calories. Whale blubber, rendered or dried, could sustain crews for long periods. These foods carried strong flavors and smells, and later chroniclers remarked on their unpleasantness. Yet for those crossing the Greenland Sea, they were invaluable. Horse meat, while taboo in parts of Christian Europe, was eaten in pagan Scandinavia. In times of need, it was preserved like other meats, packed in whey or smoked for later use. The conversion to Christianity, beginning in the late 10th century, brought prohibitions against eating horse, yet archaeological remains show its consumption continued quietly in rural areas. On ships, practicality outweighed piety. If horse meat kept men alive, it was used. Alongside these preserved meats, Vikings carried sausages made from offal and fat, dried hard until nearly inedible without cooking. They were compact, efficient, and able to last weeks. Archaeological hints of sausage casings and saga references to blood sausages, Lothmer confirmed their place in the Norse diet. For sailors, they were another example of food, designed less for pleasure than for endurance. Fish beyond cod also appeared. Herring, haddock, and salmon could be dried or smoked, adding variety to the otherwise monotonous stockfish. In some regions, fermented fish was prepared, sealed in barrels and left to sour until it became soft and pungent. Similar traditions survive today in Nordic countries, where fermented fish remains a controversial but enduring food. For Vikings at sea, fermentation meant one more way to turn perishable flesh into something that resisted decay. Vegetables and fruits were rarer, but not absent. On shorter voyages, Barrels of cabbage, turnips, or onions might be carried, pickled in whey or brine to preserve them. Wild berries were sometimes dried and packed into sacks, providing small amounts of sugar and vitamins. Archaeological finds of seeds and fruit pits at Viking sites such as Hedeby confirm that berries, especially bilberries and cloudberries, were consumed. These small additions may have helped balance the otherwise protein-heavy diet. What seems bizarre to us was, for the Vikings, entirely practical. To preserve meat in whey, to dry fish until it was hard as wood, to eat sausages of blood and fat, or even to experiment with souring fish in unconventional ways, these were not choices made from curiosity but from necessity. The sea demanded compromises. Taste, texture, and even smell were secondary. What mattered was that food could travel. The psychological challenge of such a diet should not be underestimated. Sagas and later chronicles hint at the monotony of meals, the longing for fresh bread, fruit, or roasted meat. Men endured the sourness of whey, the hardness of stockfish, the heaviness of dried sausage, because survival left no alternative. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from Viking cemeteries have noted the signs of protein-heavy diets and evidence of seasonal malnutrition. Even with their ingenuity, voyages were risks. Yet the strange preserved foods offered just enough margin to endure. These foods also reflected hierarchy. Chieftains or wealthy merchants might have access to more varied provisions, imported wine, small casks of honey, better cuts of meat preserved carefully. Ordinary sailors subsisted on the harsher rations, whey-soaked lamb, dried fish, and ale. This disparity is echoed in saga literature, where feasts and voyages are described differently depending on the status of those involved. Food was survival, but it was also a marker of rank. In the end, the odd meats and unusual preservatives were not curiosities to the Vikings themselves. They were tools. Like axes or sails, they were designed for function. If a barrel of sour whey kept meat edible across the North Atlantic, it was as valuable as a strong oar. To us, long voyages brought more than storms and hunger. A quieter enemy crept aboard Viking ships. The slow erosion of health that came when fresh plants disappeared from the diet. Centuries later, sailors would learn to call it scurvy, a wasting sickness caused by lack of vitamin C. Gums bled, wounds failed to heal, and fatigue consumed the body. For many medieval crews elsewhere, this invisible foe was as deadly as any storm. Yet Viking expeditions, crossing the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, endured for weeks or months with surprising success. How did they manage it? The answer lies not in citrus or imported fruit, but in the strange blend of fermentation, preserved fish, and organ meats that quietly defended their health. The Viking diet, as harsh as it seems, contained hidden nutrients. Skyr, the thick curd that filled barrels on every farm, retained small amounts of vitamin C. Its sour byproduct, whey, preserved those same traces. Though not abundant, when consumed daily, it may have supplied enough to prevent severe deficiency. Archaeological analysis of dairy residues at Norse farmsteads shows widespread use of fermentation, and sagas describe Skyr as a staple for both children and adults. In an environment where citrus was unknown, this simple dairy acted as an overlooked shield against disease. Fermented foods offered more protection. Vegetables, cabbage, turnips, or wild greens were sometimes submerged in whey or brine, creating pickles that could last through winter or travel at sea. Traces of such practices survive in ethnographic traditions from Iceland and the Faroes, where sour cabbage and root vegetables remained common for centuries. Though small in quantity, these preserved plants supplied crucial vitamins. For Viking sailors, even a few bites of sour greens might have meant the difference between stamina and collapse. Fish itself provided another safeguard. While dried stockfish lost much of its vitamin C, freshly caught fish consumed raw or lightly cooked retained enough to help. In coastal regions of Norway and Iceland, traditions of eating raw liver or fresh roe endured well into later centuries. Organs, often ignored in modern diets, were valued by the Norse. The liver, heart, and kidneys of freshly killed animals contain nutrients absent from muscle meat. Archaeological studies of butchering marks on animal bones from Viking settlements suggest that these parts were not discarded, but consumed. By eating organ meat soon after slaughter, sailors and settlers gained access to vitamins critical for survival in an otherwise bleak diet. This reliance on raw or fermented foods is echoed in later accounts of Arctic peoples. Inuit diets, based on raw seal, whale, and fish, supplied vitamin C despite the absence of fruits or vegetables. The Vikings, living in a similar climate, seem to have stumbled upon comparable practices, though rooted in their own traditions. It was not an explicit understanding of nutrition. They knew nothing of vitamins, but a cultural memory of what kept people alive. The monotony of their provisions concealed these small but vital choices. A sailor might chew stockfish day after day, but when the ship put in near Greenland, seal meat or reindeer liver might be added. When porridge became dull, whey pickles could be stirred in. Skyr, spooned from a barrel, offered more than protein. It offered resilience against sickness. To the Vikings, these foods were simply part of life. To us, they reveal an accidental but effective defense against a disease that would later claim thousands of lives on European voyages. Still, the risk was real. Some voyages undoubtedly faced shortages. Skeletal remains from Norse settlements in Greenland show signs of nutritional stress. Children's bones, in particular, reveal evidence of deficiencies, though whether from scurvy or other causes is debated. The sagas are largely silent on disease at sea, but occasional hints appear, references to weakness, exhaustion, or strange deaths during hard winters. Such accounts remind us that their diet was not foolproof. Survival depended on careful planning, fortunate hunting, and the constant interplay of preserved and fresh food whenever available. Fermentation was more than preservation. It was adaptation. By souring milk, vegetables, or meat, Vikings not only extended shelf life, but altered the nutritional content. Modern studies of fermented foods confirm that they release vitamins, create probiotics, and improve digestion. The Norse could not have known the chemistry, but they observed the results. A family that relied on sour milk and pickled greens fared better through winter than one that had none. A crew that carried barrels of skyr endured longer at sea. These patterns became tradition, embedded in culture and repeated generation after generation. The psychological aspect mattered as well. Eating sour foods carried symbolic weight, marking endurance. To consume whey-pickled meat or fermented cabbage was to accept hardship without complaint. In the sagas, insults sometimes mocked men for being soft or unwilling to endure harsh food, linking diet with honor. By turning sour preservation into a cultural norm, the Vikings made resilience itself part of their identity. Thus, while later European sailors perished from scurvy in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Vikings crossed the same waters centuries earlier with fewer losses. They did not have citrus or medical knowledge. What they had was habit, the daily sourness of whey, the tang of skyr, the occasional chew of organ meat, the pickled greens carried in barrels. These simple, sometimes bizarre foods acted as their defense against an invisible enemy. What seems strange to us, the taste of sour milk, the reliance on raw liver, the chewing of hard-dried fish, was to them not odd at all. It was tradition, rooted in the environment, tested by hardship, and quietly effective. On their long journeys across gray northern seas, this diet, harsh and uncelebrated, gave them the strength to endure. The thought of eating urine-treated fish or whey-cured lamb may sound unpalatable. To a Viking at sea, it sounded like life. Every Viking voyage was an exercise in calculation. A ship could not carry everything. Space was limited, and every item chosen had to justify its weight. Oars, sails, tools, weapons, trade goods, livestock, and provisions all competed for the same cramped storage in the hold of a nar or longship. Food was not simply gathered at random. It was measured, balanced, and considered as carefully as any weapon or shield. The Viking diet at sea was shaped as much by logistics as by tradition, designed to endure the unpredictable length of journeys where a single miscalculation could mean starvation. The first principle was weight versus energy. Stockfish became the primary staple because it was unusually light for the energy it carried. Drying stripped away most of its water, leaving behind concentrated protein that could be stored in bulk. A single barrel of stockfish provided more sustenance than several barrels of fresh meat. Grain, too, was efficient. Barley and oats stored in sacks took up less space than bread or baked goods, and porridge could be made fresh whenever water and fire were available. Archaeological finds of quern stones on Norse farmsteads show how households prepared to grind grain before voyages, ensuring that flour was ready to travel. The careful choice of dried fish and grain was not only about tradition, it was about maximizing return on every pound carried. Preservation methods also reflected this principle. Whey-pickled meat lasted longer than fresh cuts, allowing smaller quantities of valuable livestock to be stretched across months. Dairy products, like skyr and butter, condensed the energy of milk into more portable forms. Archaeologists excavating Viking farmsteads in Iceland have found large storage pits lined with stone, where dairy and meat were prepared for long-term keeping. These were not luxuries, but calculated solutions, foods that could survive weeks in the hold of a ship without turning lethal. The design of the ship itself influenced diet. Longships, narrow and built for raiding, had little room for bulky supplies. Crews traveling on them relied more heavily on preserved foods that could be carried in compact sacks and barrels. Merchant nars, broader and deeper, offered more space and could carry livestock or fresh provisions for longer stretches. Evidence from trading ports like Hedeby and Birka suggests that nars sailing between Scandinavia and the British Isles often carried not only dried fish but also live sheep or goats, which could provide fresh milk and meat partway through the journey. The type of vessel determined whether the crew subsisted almost entirely on hard rations or could supplement with fresh food along the way. Voyages were timed with the seasonal cycle, another form of logistical planning. Crews knew that sailing in summer offered longer days, calmer seas, and access to fresh fish and berries along the coasts. A voyage launched in late spring carried grain from the last harvest, dairy from the summer's milk, and stockfish dried through the winter months. The rhythm of agricultural and fishing life directly structured the menu at sea. Archaeological finds of seasonal camps, with traces of drying racks and butchering sites, show that preparation for voyages often began months before departure. Food was not an afterthought. It was planned as carefully as the forging of weapons or the carving of a ship's keel. Portions were controlled through rationing. Sagas rarely dwell on the details of shipboard meals, but hints suggest strict distribution. Each man received measured shares of stockfish or porridge, overseen by the ship's leader. Ale was poured in order, often beginning with the highest-ranking men, reinforcing hierarchy. Too much consumed too quickly endangered the voyage. Too little risked weakness at the oar. This balance required discipline, and archaeological traces of storage containers, barrels, wooden tubs, and sealed skin bags remind us that food was stored not for comfort but for careful control. Redundancy was another key principle. Ships rarely relied on one type of food alone. Dried fish, grain, meat in whey, butter, and ale were packed together, providing insurance if one failed. If barrels of water soured, ale remained drinkable. If fish spoiled, porridge could sustain the crew. This layered approach ensured that even when luck faltered, survival remained possible. The archaeological discovery of mixed food remains in refuse heaps at Viking ports, suggests that sailors drew from multiple provisions simultaneously, not sequentially, spreading risk across different food types. Even the containers mattered. Barrels were lined with pitch to reduce leakage. Leather bags were stitched tightly to hold butter or soft cheese. Clay pots, sometimes wrapped in cloth, carried skyr. Each vessel represented knowledge of how to make fragile foods, endure the brutal conditions of salt air, shifting temperatures, and constant motion. In Greenland, archaeologists have found fragments of wooden tubs stained with dairy residues, likely once carried aboard ships. These fragments show how humble materials, wood, leather, clay, became part of the invisible infrastructure of survival. Finally, the Viking approach to food design reflected their worldview. Survival was not luck, it was preparation. Just as a warrior sharpened his sword before a raid, a household prepared food before a voyage. Stockfish drying on racks in Lofoten was as important to the success of an expedition as the forging of spears in a blacksmith's hut. butter churned in a remote Icelandic farmstead, could mean life or death for men rowing into the unknown. The logistics of diet reveal the same qualities admired in Viking sagas: foresight, resilience, and the ability to endure hardship through discipline. To modern eyes, their provisions appear bleak. Hard fish, sour milk, dense porridge, and barrels of thin ale lack the variety or richness we expect. But behind that bleakness lay deliberate design. Every ration carried on board was chosen because it survived the longest, weighed the least, and offered the most energy for its size. This logic, harsh though it seems, was the quiet reason Viking ships could cross seas that others dared not. Their diet was not a failure of taste, but a triumph of planning. Food aboard a Viking ship was more than sustenance. It carried weight as a marker of status, generosity, and honor. To share provisions was not merely to keep men alive, it was to uphold a social code that stretched from the longhouse to the open sea. For Norsemen, diet was never separate from culture. Every dried fish, every ladle of porridge, every horn of ale reinforced bonds of loyalty and expectations of leadership. The sagas remind us repeatedly that hospitality defined character. A chieftain was judged by how well he could feed his followers. At feasts, the amount and quality of food distributed established rank. A leader who allowed his men to go hungry, or who failed to provide enough for long voyages, risked more than grumbling stomachs. He risked his reputation. The same principle carried onto the deck of a ship. The captain or leader bore the responsibility of provisioning wisely, ensuring every man received his share. To ration poorly was dishonor. To provide generously, even in hardship, was to win loyalty that could endure storms, battles, and hunger alike. Meals at sea were also moments of ritual and hierarchy. The order of serving mattered. Higher-ranking men often ate first, with common sailors following. The distribution of ale in horns reflected not only thirst, but social standing. A horn passed too soon or too late could be seen as disrespectful, even in the cramped quarters of a ship where space and comfort were scarce. The meal became a miniature reflection of the longhouse, complete with its codes of respect and order. Generosity was expected even in scarcity. The sagas speak often of men remembered for sharing their last portion, for giving bread or meat to a companion when hunger pressed hardest. Such acts of provision were more than kindness. They were statements of honor. A man who shared in famine proved his strength. A man who hoarded in secret risked eternal shame. Archaeological evidence of communal cooking vessels found at Viking encampments and ports supports this image. Meals were prepared and eaten together, reinforcing the idea that survival was collective, not solitary. Food was also bound to the ritual of oath and brotherhood. Drinking ale together was more than quenching thirst. It was binding men in agreement. The sagas describe feasts where decisions of war, alliance, and vengeance were sealed over shared drink. At sea, this tradition continued in smaller form. A horn passed across the ship became not only refreshment, but a symbol of trust. Even preserved whey or thin ale, hardly luxurious, gained meaning when shared at the right moment, under the watch of comrades and gods. Provision also extended to the unexpected guest. Viking culture prized the ability to feed strangers, even when stores ran low. A ship putting into a distant harbor might be greeted with offers of fish or bread, exchanged in the spirit of hospitality. Likewise, a well-provisioned ship was expected to extend food to allies, or, when necessary, to enemies captured at sea. To feed was to assert dominance as well as generosity, for only the strong could afford to give away food. The archaeology of Viking trading towns reveals feasting halls near harbors, suggesting that hospitality was offered not only on land, but extended symbolically to the sea. The meaning of food was reinforced through poetry and saga memory. Warriors were praised for surviving on little, but leaders were remembered for providing plenty. A skald's verse might commemorate not only victories in battle, but also the abundance of ale or meat at a feast. To ensure that his name lived on, a leader needed to provision his followers well, in peace and at sea. What seems to us like mere sustenance was to the Vikings a matter of legacy. The sharing of hardship through food created bonds that outlived voyages. A man who had eaten the same stockfish and porridge day after day beside his shipmates carried that memory into future battles. The monotony itself became a test of loyalty. Enduring the sourness of whey or the toughness of dried fish together proved commitment. Meals thus acted as both necessity and ritual of cohesion. We glimpse these values in the traces left behind. At camps along the Greenland coast, archaeologists have found communal cooking hearths, large enough for several crews to use at once. The ashes contain layers of fish bones, charred grain, and burned fat, pointing to meals taken in company. These sites, temporary as they were, carried the longhouse culture of hospitality into the wilderness. Even on the edge of the known world, the Norse did not abandon their values. Food was shared, hierarchy was respected, and provision was remembered. In this way, diet was more than survival, it was identity. To endure hunger without complaint, to share in scarcity, to provide generously, to respect order at meals. All these formed part of what it meant to be Norse. The Viking diet at sea, bleak though it may appear, was bound to the same codes that shaped feasts ashore. A barrel of skyr, a sack of grain, a pile of dried fish, all carried weight beyond nutrition. They represented honor, loyalty, and the memory of provision that defined leaders and bound crews together. Thus, when we speak of the Viking diet, we must remember it was not only calories calculated for survival, it was a system of meaning, tying together hunger and honor, necessity and generosity, survival and memory. On the gray seas, amid storms and silence, each portion given and taken carried with it the weight of tradition. For the Vikings, food was never only food, it was the measure of the man who shared it. When we imagine food, we imagine taste. Yet for the Vikings at sea, flavor was the least reliable companion. Their diet, designed for endurance, produced textures and tastes that modern palates might call harsh, even unpleasant. To understand their meals is not only to list ingredients, but to step into the sensory world of preservation, scarcity, and necessity. The Viking diet was as much about the experience of chewing as it was about the act of eating. The most constant flavor was that of salt and dryness. Stockfish, stripped of water and left to hang in the northern winds, became as hard as wood. To eat it, sailors often softened it by pounding it with the blunt side of an axe or soaking it briefly in liquid. Even then, it remained tough, demanding long chewing before yielding its protein. Its taste was not fresh fish, but something closer to leather, infused with the faint memory of the sea. To eat stockfish was to confront resistance with every bite, a reminder that survival was not meant to be easy. Grain, in the form of porridge or bread, added another layer to the sensory landscape. Barley porridge, thickened with water or whey, produced a heavy, earthy taste. It was dense, filling, and bland, more texture than flavor. When oats were used, the porridge carried a faint sweetness, but rarely enough to mask its monotony. Bread baked in flat cakes was often coarse and dry, made with stone-ground flour that left fragments of husk and grit. Chewing Viking bread was not unlike chewing rough earth. It filled the stomach but did little to please the tongue. Archaeological remains of charred bread loaves in Viking hearths confirm this rugged texture, dense, dark, and far from the softness of modern wheat bread. Dairy products brought sourness. Skyr, a form of fermented milk, carried a sharp tang that lingered on the tongue. Butter, when fresh, softened meals with fat, but when stored too long, developed strong flavors that modern tastes might call rancid. Whey-pickled meats absorbed this same sourness, their saltiness blending with a vinegary sharpness. These were not meals of subtle seasoning, they were meals of overwhelming taste, dominated by acid, salt, and bitterness. Occasionally, meals were softened with ale or mead. Ale brewed weak for daily drinking carried the earthy flavor of barley and the faint bitterness of herbs. Mead, when available, brought sweetness from honey, though it was rarer at sea. Yet even these drinks were not luxuries. Ale soured quickly and could taste more fermentation than freshness. Still, to a crew chewing endlessly on stockfish, even thin ale offered relief, a brief wash of flavor to ease the monotony of dryness and salt. The smell of Viking provisions added to the experience. Stockfish carried the constant odor of dried sea, sharp and musty. Barley porridge smelled of earth and smoke from the fire. Fermented dairy gave off strong, sour notes, filling the cramped air of a ship's hold. These were scents of survival, not comfort. To sit among barrels of fish, bags of grain, and tubs of sour milk was to live in a haze of odors that clung to skin, clothes, and sails. Meals were not entirely without variation. On coasts and islands, Vikings sometimes caught fresh fish, roasted over driftwood fires. Archaeological remains of cod, herring, and salmon bones at temporary camps show that fresh catches supplemented dried stores when possible. In summer voyages, berries gathered ashore added fleeting sweetness. Bilberries, lingonberries, or crowberries, eaten raw or mixed into porridge. But these were brief reprieves, moments of contrast rather than staples. The experience of eating together amplified these tastes. Men gnawed side by side on tough stockfish, chewed porridge thickened with whey, drank ale that had begun to sour. The shared endurance of these flavors became part of camaraderie. Complaints were rare, for endurance itself was praised. The sagas celebrate men who endured hunger and hardship without weakness. To eat without protest, even when taste turned foul, was to prove one's strength. It is telling that saga descriptions of feasts dwell on roasted meats, rich ale, and abundance, but remain quiet on the details of shipboard meals. Silence itself suggests that these foods were not remembered for pleasure. They were endured, not celebrated. When men returned home, the meals that became verse were those of the longhouse, not the deck of a ship. Yet the quiet monotony of stockfish and porridge made those later feasts all the more meaningful. Archaeological evidence supports this harsh palate. Residues scraped from Viking cooking pots contain traces of fish oils, barley, and dairy, simple mixtures boiled into thick gruel. Charred remains of bread suggest heavy loaves baked without much leavening. Chemical traces in wooden barrels reveal storage of dairy, whose sourness was unavoidable after weeks in transit. The material record confirms what the sagas leave unsaid, that the Viking diet at sea was defined less by pleasure than by endurance. To eat as the Vikings did was to live with the taste of survival. Every bite reminded the crew of where they were and why they endured. Salt, sourness, bitterness, dryness, these were the tastes that carried them across oceans. Their food did not comfort, but hardened. It trained the body to persist, the stomach to accept, the mind to resist complaint. And yet, within that bleakness, meaning was found. Each chew of stockfish reminded a sailor that he was among men who endured the same. Each ladle of porridge reinforced the bonds of survival. Each sip of ale, however sour, was still shared. These tastes, harsh though they were, became part of the Viking identity. They shaped not only the stomach but the culture, reminding all who sailed that survival was not sweet. It was dry, salty, sour, and bitter, and it was theirs. Much of what we know about the Viking diet does not come from the sagas alone, but from the soil beneath our feet. The ground has preserved traces of their meals in ways that words did not. Charred grains, discarded bones, residues on pots, even chemical signatures in the wood of barrels, all offer a glimpse of what sustained them when no fresh harvest could be reached. Archaeology, patient and quiet, has become the truest witness of Viking provisions. At L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Norse site in North America, excavations revealed the bones of cod split and dried in the northern air. These fragments suggest the same technique used in Norway. Fish stiffened by frost and wind, light to transport, dense with protein. The presence of these bones, so far from Scandinavia, shows that dried fish was not only a homeland staple, but a provision carried across the Atlantic. For the Vikings who landed there, the familiarity of stockfish was perhaps the only comfort in an unfamiliar land. In Greenlandic settlements, archaeologists have uncovered middens filled with seal bones, walrus remains, and fragments of whale. These animals supplemented imported goods, proving that Norse settlers turned to the sea when agricultural stores ran thin. Chemical analysis of soil near Viking farmsteads reveals residues of dairy fat, confirming that milk and skyr remain central. Yet the bones of marine mammals speak of adaptation, provisions shaped by environment, not tradition alone. Closer to Scandinavia, excavations at Hedeby, the great trading town, unearthed charred bread loaves. Their texture, dense and coarse, speaks to the grinding stones that left grit in the flour. Porridge pots found nearby bear residues of barley starch. Together they confirm what the sagas left vague, that daily bread was rough and porridge was constant. Hedeby's harbor, filled with ships bound for distant coasts, was likely stocked with these very provisions, carried on journeys that reached the edges of the known world. At York in England, once the Viking town of Jorvik, archaeologists discovered wooden barrels with chemical traces of dairy. Some contained butter, others fermented milk products. Analysis revealed high levels of lactic acid, evidence of sourness long preserved. These finds suggest that dairy traveled with the Vikings as far as their colonies abroad. Even in new lands, they carried the familiar taste of whey and skyr, ensuring continuity of diet far from home. Excavations of burial sites also tell part of the story. In graves of high-ranking individuals, vessels sometimes contain traces of food, fish bones, animal fat, or grain. These offerings were not only symbols of sustenance for the afterlife, but reflections of the foods considered most vital in life. To bury a man with dried fish or porridge residue was to acknowledge what had carried him through journeys on earth. Food, in this way, bridged survival and eternity. The evidence is not only material, but microscopic. Soil samples from Viking camps have revealed pollen from barley and oats, confirming the cultivation and use of grains even in temporary sites. Analysis of human remains through isotopes in bones and teeth shows a diet rich in fish protein, dairy fats, and occasional meat. These scientific signatures confirm what the sagas hint at, that the Viking body was built on stockfish, milk, and grain, not on endless feasts of roasted meat. Cooking equipment adds another layer. At sites along fjords and rivers, iron cauldrons and soapstone pots have been unearthed. Residues inside contain mixtures of fish oils, barley starch, and milk proteins, evidence of thick stews or porridges shared communally. Soapstone, quarried in Norway, was particularly valued because it held heat well and could be carried aboard ships. The presence of these pots in ports and camps suggests that the same meals were prepared at sea as on land, linking the shipboard diet with the household hearth. Even the rubbish of daily life has preserved secrets. In refuse heaps at Viking-age settlements, archaeologists have found broken animal bones with cut marks, showing how meat was butchered and rationed. The overwhelming presence of fish bones, however, dwarfs the number of mammal remains, confirming the dominance of the sea in the Norse diet. The disposal patterns themselves, bones broken for marrow, fish split for drying, reveal habits of preservation essential for long voyages. The material record also confirms the monotony. Sites rarely show evidence of spices, fruits, or luxuries, except in elite contexts. For the average sailor, provisions were practical, not decorative. Grain, fish, and dairy dominate every sample. Even when dried berries appear, they are rare traces, not daily fare. Archaeology strips away the romantic vision of Viking feasts and replaces it with the stubborn reality of endurance food. Yet, within this monotony, archaeology also shows resilience. The adaptations seen in Greenland, the turn to seals and whales, the use of local berries, demonstrates flexibility. The Vikings did not starve when harvests failed. They shifted, drawing on whatever could be stored, dried, or fermented. The bones and residues left behind testify to an ingenuity shaped by necessity, one that allowed survival on coasts where no grain could grow. In the end, the soil speaks with clarity. The Viking diet at sea was not guesswork or legend. It is written in bones, ash, and residue. Each charred grain, each fragment of stockfish, each lactic trace in a barrel adds to a picture that words alone cannot give. Archaeology confirms the sagas, corrects them, and fills their silences. What the Vikings ate, how they stored it, and how they endured is preserved not in poetry, but in the quiet witness of the ground. Food for the Vikings was never only food. It was survival, yes, but also ritual, order, and meaning. Even in the harsh monotony of porridge and stockfish, meals were woven into the rhythms of their society. To eat together was to share not just provisions but identity. In longhouses, at camps, and even aboard ships, the act of eating became a form of structure in lives that were often uncertain. The longhouse meal offers the clearest example. Archaeological evidence of hearths stretching down the center of great timber halls, blackened with centuries of smoke, shows where meals were prepared and consumed. The fire gave warmth, light, and food all at once. Along the sides of these halls, benches held men who ate in rank order, the highest seated nearest the fire, the lowest toward the doors. Food thus reinforced hierarchy. Where you sat, what you were served, and how much you received reflected your standing in the community. Meals became a mirror of society, turning hunger into structure. At feasts, food and drink were tied to ritual speech and oath-making. The sagas describe the passing of horns filled with ale or mead, each accompanied by words that bound men to loyalty, vengeance, or remembrance. To drink in turn in the proper order was as important as the drink itself. Refusing was unthinkable. What began as sustenance became a contract, each sip carrying obligations. In these moments, provisions became politics. Even simple meals had their ritual rhythm. At sea, food was rationed with care. The steersman, often responsible for discipline aboard, ensured fair distribution. Meals were taken together, often twice a day, not whenever one man grew hungry. This enforced equality, preventing quarrels and maintaining morale. Eating was thus bound by rule as much as by appetite. A crew that shared the same porridge and fish endured not only the same hunger, but the same discipline. Religious belief also entered the meal. Sacrifices to the gods, known as blot, often involved food and drink. Animals were slaughtered, their blood sprinkled in ritual, and their meat shared among the community. The act of consuming together bound men not only to each other but to the gods. Archaeological finds of animal bones at cult sites suggest that eating was central to worship. Food thus crossed from the mundane into the sacred, a way of joining human need with divine favor. The sagas recall gestures that turned eating into a language of respect. To offer meat to a guest was a sign of honor. To withhold ale was an insult. Even the simple act of who carved the meat or who served the bread could speak of authority. In Eagle's saga, feasts are described not only for what was eaten, but for who controlled the table. A man's power was measured by his ability to provide food, and his reputation could rise or fall depending on how well he fed others. At sea, rituals were simpler but no less meaningful. A barrel of ale opened on the first day of a long voyage carried more than refreshment. It marked the beginning of endurance. Meals taken on calm seas might include brief words of thanks, not formal prayers but acknowledgments of necessity. To share food in the middle of vast waters was a reminder of community. Even the act of chewing tough stockfish in silence became ritual, repeated day after day until it carried weight beyond the food itself. Food also entered the ritual of storytelling. After meals, when bellies were heavy with porridge or meat, sagas were recited. The connection between eating and memory was deep. To tell stories after eating was to turn sustenance into meaning, to make survival itself part of the larger tale of the community. A man who ate with others, and then told or heard a saga, carried both food and story within him, strengthening body and mind alike. Rituals of eating extended even to death and remembrance. In funeral feasts, food was offered to honor the dead. Archaeological evidence of vessels placed in graves suggests that provisions accompanied the departed on their final journey. The living, meanwhile, ate in memory of those gone. A meal thus connected the present with the past, ensuring that no one truly left the circle of shared sustenance. What emerges from this is a picture of Viking food as more than fuel. Each act of eating was layered. Survival, social order, religious meaning, and cultural memory all intertwined. A simple bowl of porridge could hold within it hierarchy, ritual, and identity. Stockfish gnawed on deck was not only protein but proof of discipline. Ale passed at a feast was not merely drink but oath. In this way, the bizarre Viking diet, salted, sour, dry, and bitter, was transformed. Harsh tastes became symbols of endurance. Shared meals became symbols of unity. Food that might seem unappealing to us carried layers of meaning for them. It was not flavor that mattered, but the ritual of survival and belonging that each bite carried. To understand the Viking diet, then, is not only to list what they ate, but to see how meals structured their world. Food kept them alive, but ritual gave that survival meaning. Together, they formed the quiet rhythm of Viking life, one meal after another, chewed, swallowed, and remembered. The Viking diet was built for survival, but survival always came with a cost. The food that kept them alive for months at sea was not designed for comfort or long-term health. It was practical, portable, and resilient against rot. Yet it shaped their bodies in ways both strong and fragile. Archaeological studies of Viking skeletons, combined with written sources and the chemistry of preserved remains, allow us to glimpse the physical consequences of eating stockfish, hard bread, and sour whey day after day. The first impact was strength through protein. Stockfish, the dried cod that became a cornerstone of their diet, was dense in protein and almost fat-free. Combined with occasional meat and dairy, it built strong muscle. Isotope analysis of Viking bones reveals high levels of nitrogen, a marker of protein-rich diets. This suggests that, compared to many medieval populations, the Norse consumed more protein than grain-heavy farmers in continental Europe. Their ability to row for hours and fight for days was not only a matter of training, it was fueled by the concentrated nutrition of dried fish and dairy fats. Yet protein came with a shadow. The lack of fresh fruit or vegetables during long voyages created a risk of scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency. Archaeologists studying Viking-age skeletons have found evidence of porous lesions on bones, consistent with scurvy. Written accounts from later northern explorers mirror this pattern. Strength fading into weakness, wounds failing to heal, gums bleeding. The Vikings, however, may have lessened this risk by carrying dried berries, such as cloudberries and lingonberries, which can retain vitamin C when properly preserved. Still, such supplies were limited and often reserved for chiefs or special occasions. For the common sailor, the weeks of nothing but fish and porridge left silent scars on the body. Another health challenge was dental wear. Viking bread was ground on stone querns, which left grit in the flour. Over time, this wore down teeth, creating grooves and exposing roots. Even young skeletons show severe dental abrasion, a lifetime of chewing coarse bread and tough stockfish. Combined with the high acidity of fermented dairy products, this led to frequent tooth decay. Yet missing teeth rarely stopped them. Archaeological remains show jaws healed from extractions or broken teeth, evidence that they simply adapted to the pain and carried on. The reliance on salted meat and fish also strained the kidneys and heart. Salt was essential to preservation, but excessive intake could lead to hypertension. Skeletal remains show calcifications in arteries, suggesting cardiovascular stress. Yet the Vikings offset this somewhat with a physically demanding lifestyle. Constant rowing, hauling sails, and farming meant calories were burned quickly, and the body stayed lean even when diets were heavy in salt and fat. There were also benefits of fermentation. Skyr, sour whey, and other fermented products were rich in probiotics, though the Vikings never used such a word. These foods helped maintain gut health in the absence of fresh produce. The lactic acid bacteria preserved in skyr likely reduced foodborne illness, which would have been a constant threat on long voyages. While stomach ailments were common, the evidence suggests that the Viking reliance on sour dairy reduced the risks compared to eating only raw or rotting food. Malnutrition, however, remained a danger. Long voyages often led to stunted growth in children raised in coastal settlements that relied heavily on preserved food. Skeletal analysis shows signs of rickets and anemia in some populations, caused by vitamin D and iron deficiencies. Limited exposure to sunlight in northern latitudes worsened these conditions. For adults, the monotony of diet meant survival, but at the expense of long-term vitality. Despite these weaknesses, Viking bodies were remarkably resilient. Average life expectancy may have been short, around 40 years, but this was due as much to violence and disease as to diet. Those who survived childhood often reached middle age with strong bones and dense muscle mass. Their diet, though harsh, gave them the fuel to endure winters, sail across oceans, and fight prolonged battles. Compared to many contemporary populations, they carried fewer signs of famine-related stress. The sea, harsh as it was, provided a more stable supply of protein than land harvests could always guarantee. Food also affected mental resilience. Monotonous diets can erode morale, but ritualized meals and communal eating help transform necessity into endurance. Sharing the same tough stockfish day after day created unity. It was not just the body that adapted, but the mind. A sailor chewing dried cod alongside his shipmates was reminded that his hunger was the same as theirs, and that endurance was shared. This psychological resilience was as important as nutrition in keeping crews functional for months at sea. In the archaeological record, these truths are visible. Bones marked by lesions of scurvy, teeth ground by grit, arteries hardened by salt, but also muscles built strong, frames tall and broad, compared to many European contemporaries. The Viking diet shaped a people who could endure extremes, trading comfort for survival, variety for strength. What emerges is not a picture of perfect health, but of functional health. Bodies adapted to a diet of necessity, capable of labor, war, and exploration, even at hidden cost. The Vikings endured because their food allowed them to endure, not because it nourished in every way. Their strength was purchased by sacrifice, their survival marked in bone. The Viking diet at sea was harsh, but once on land their tables could change dramatically. Through raids, trade, and travel, the Norse encountered foods far removed from dried cod and sour whey. These exotic provisions not only added variety to their meals, but also revealed the breadth of Viking connections across Europe and beyond. Archaeological finds, combined with saga descriptions and foreign chronicles, show a world where honey, spices, and foreign grains could make their way into even the northernmost longhouses. The most valuable import was spices. Peppercorns from the east have been found in Viking Age graves, small and rare, but telling. These were not everyday seasonings, but luxury items, consumed sparingly to elevate feasts. Chronicles from England describe Viking leaders demanding not only silver, but also spices as tribute. A stew flavored with pepper or coriander would have stood out against the blandness of salted meats, transforming necessity into luxury. Such tastes were reminders of distant lands and the wealth of conquest. Wine also flowed into Viking hands. While mead and ale were their own brews, wine was imported, often seized from monasteries, or traded through contacts in the Frankish world. Amphorae fragments and glass drinking vessels unearthed in Denmark and Sweden suggest that wine reached elite households. For common sailors, wine was unattainable, but for jarls and kings it was a marker of status. To drink wine at a feast was to show connection to the wider world, and to demonstrate that raids yielded more than silver. It brought culture and prestige. From the east, through the great river routes that reached Constantinople, came exotic fruits and nuts. Archaeological digs in Birka, a major Swedish trading town, have uncovered figs, walnuts, and even silk among the goods present. Such items were scarce and likely reserved for the wealthiest, but their presence confirms that Viking tables could occasionally host foods from the Mediterranean. A fig, dried and sweet, would have been a marvel to those used only to sour berries and bitter herbs. Raids on monasteries in England and Ireland also introduced the Vikings to foreign dairy practices and breads. Monks were skilled at cheese making, producing hard varieties that lasted longer than the soft skyr of the north. The Vikings took both the cheese and the knowledge, adding it to their own food culture. Likewise, finer breads, made from wheat rather than barley, were discovered in these raids. In Scandinavia, wheat was rare and often imported. Barley and rye were the staples. To eat soft wheat bread was a luxury, tied to foreign conquest. Another prized good was honey, gathered at home but also taken abroad. Honey was not only food but currency, used to sweeten ale and preserve fruit. Mead, the fermented honey drink, carried ritual significance, connecting men to both celebration and the gods. Honeycomb stolen from foreign lands expanded supplies, and honey became both a practical provision and a sacred offering. In sagas, to offer mead sweetened with honey was an act of honor, far surpassing common ale. Contacts with the East may have introduced rice in small quantities, though evidence is sparse. More certain is the arrival of flaxseed and sesame, used for oil and baking. While not staples, they reveal the reach of Viking trade into lands far from their northern homes. The Silk Road, though indirect, touched the Norse through middlemen. Exotic foodstuffs thus moved alongside silver, weapons, and cloth, reminding us that Viking raiding was always balanced with trading. Not all exotic foods were luxuries. The Vikings also acquired new preservation methods, which in time reshaped their diets. Salt from English coasts and Frankish mines was taken in bulk, improving their ability to preserve fish and meat. Though they already salted provisions, larger supplies allowed for longer voyages and bigger armies. What they raided was not just to be consumed immediately, but to strengthen survival for seasons ahead. Exotic foods also had a role in ritual and display. Feasts became arenas where wealth was shown through food as much as treasure. A jarl who could serve figs or pepper-flavored stew demonstrated power in a way silver alone could not. Foreign foods became symbols of reach. To eat walnuts in a hall in Norway was to show mastery over seas and lands far away. The meal itself became a map of conquest. The sagas remember these moments. In Eagle's saga, feasting is described with detail not only of meat and ale, but of variety, spices, breads, and delicacies that reflected foreign influence. Though the majority of Vikings lived on porridge and dried fish, these stories remind us that at the highest levels, exotic foods marked status. Archaeology and text together show a two-tier diet: survival for most, luxury for few. Even so, exotic foods were not meaningless to the common man. Though rare, when shared they became memories, reminders of what raids and trade could bring. A sailor who once tasted fig or fine cheese might carry that story home, turning food into legend. Exotic flavors were thus folded into Viking identity, part of their sense of being not only northerners, but participants in a world that stretched from Baghdad to Byzantium. The Viking diet, then, was not only bizarre for its dried stockfish and sour whey, but also remarkable for its reach. From the cold of Norway to the warmth of the Mediterranean, food traveled with them, in sacks, in barrels, and in memory. Exotic foods brought not just sustenance but prestige, meaning, and the proof of distant journeys. The Viking world was one of extremes. Just as their lives swung between war and peace, travel and settlement, so too did their relationship with food. There were moments of overwhelming abundance, where halls overflowed with roasted meats, ale, and laughter. And there were times of hunger, when porridge thinned into water and dried fish was rationed carefully, one strip per day. This cycle of feast and famine defined Viking society, reminding them of both the generosity and cruelty of the world they lived in. The feast was the highest expression of plenty. Sagas describe longhouses lit with torches, tables heavy with roasted boar, mutton, venison, and poultry. Guests were seated in order of rank, the most honored near the jarl or king, their plates refilled first. Archaeological digs at great halls, such as Borg in Lofoten, Norway, have uncovered animal bones in massive quantities, evidence of large-scale slaughter for special occasions. A feast was not only about nourishment but about hierarchy, honor, and memory. At these gatherings, food was both display and promise. To serve whole roasted animals, stews enriched with imported spices, and vats of ale showed power. It told allies that the leader could provide. It told rivals that his wealth ran deep. Even exotic foods, walnuts, figs, or wine sometimes appeared at these events, reinforcing the sense of grandeur. Eating together in such excess was an act of loyalty, binding men through shared abundance. The rituals of feasting were also tied to religion. Sacrifices, known as blots, involved the slaughter of animals, their blood sprinkled on altars, and their meat consumed by the community. Feasts could therefore blend the sacred with the social, food becoming the medium through which humans and gods were joined. To eat at a sacrificial feast was to affirm the order of the cosmos as much as the bonds of the clan. But not every season was marked by abundance. The same world that could fill halls with roasted meats could also strip tables bare. Winters were long, and storms at sea could destroy harvests or prevent fishing. When supplies dwindled, famine became the teacher of humility. In such times, Vikings turned to whatever could sustain them: thin gruels of barley or oats, boiled bones for marrow, or even bark and moss. Archaeological evidence of skeletal stress shows that many lived through cycles of malnutrition, especially in settlements exposed to poor harvests. Famine was not only local but also political. Raids and wars could disrupt farming, while rulers sometimes demanded tribute that left villages hungry. Written accounts from medieval chroniclers note Norse raids driven partly by need, hungry men seeking food as much as treasure. Hunger could push the Vikings outward, turning desperation into exploration. The Greenland settlements, harsh and marginal, are thought to have faced frequent shortages. Their survival depended on imports or desperate adaptation. The contrast between feasting and famine created a rhythm of survival. In good years, harvests and successful hunts made possible the grand gatherings that sagas remembered. In bad years, the same people endured scarcity, reducing meals to the bare minimum. This cycle was not unique to Vikings, but their dependence on preserved food and the unpredictability of northern climates made the extremes sharper. Psychologically, the difference mattered. The feast was a reward, a declaration of triumph over hardship. Songs and poems recited during banquets often celebrated survival, as though the abundance on the table was proof of divine favor. Conversely, famine reinforced humility and dependence on luck, gods, and the sea. A Viking farmer might spend months in hunger, dreaming of the next feast where meat and ale would overflow again. Archaeology shows this duality clearly. Excavations at Trelleborg and other Viking ring forts reveal evidence of mass gatherings with large quantities of animal remains, suggesting enormous feasts. Yet nearby graves also reveal individuals with malnutrition scars, showing that famine left its mark just as deeply. The bones tell us that some lived and died never tasting the excess of the halls, while others swung between both extremes. In literature, sagas reflect this reality. Heroes often move between hunger and plenty, eating thin meals on voyages, then feasting gloriously upon return. The contrast heightened the drama. Food was never just background, but a measure of fortune. A hero's greatness was displayed not only in battle but at the feast, where he sat closest to the fire, and his cup was refilled first. Hunger, in turn, tested his endurance, showing strength in survival. The Viking diet, therefore, was not steady, but volatile. It reflected the instability of their world: seas that could provide or withhold, fields that could bloom or fail, raids that could enrich or starve. To the Norse, this was natural. Feast and famine were both expected, two sides of the same life. What emerges is a picture of a people accustomed to fluctuation. Unlike modern societies that seek balance, the Vikings lived at the edge, enduring hunger and celebrating plenty with equal intensity. Their survival was built not only on stockfish and porridge, but on the cultural ability to accept extremes. A Viking could starve quietly and feast loudly, and both were woven into the rhythm of their existence. When we imagine Viking warriors, we think of axes, shields, and the clash of iron. Yet behind every raid, siege, or skirmish lay a quieter question: what had these men eaten? Food and battle were bound together, for hunger shaped courage, and feasting followed victory. The meals surrounding combat reveal as much about Viking life as their weapons. They show how food was both fuel for the body and a symbol of triumph. Before battle, the Viking diet was simple and practical. Warriors needed strength, but they also needed speed. Heavy meals were avoided on the morning of combat. Instead, porridge made of oats or barley was common, sometimes enriched with whey or dried berries. Meat, if available, might be consumed in small portions, often boiled or roasted quickly. Archaeological evidence and saga accounts suggest that these meals were intended less for pleasure and more for endurance. To go into battle too full was to risk sluggishness. To go hungry was to risk collapse. There was also a ritual dimension. Before major raids, sacrifices were sometimes made. Animals were slaughtered, and their meat shared among the men. This was both nourishment and consecration, a way of asking the gods to grant victory. In these moments, the act of eating together became sacred, binding the warriors not only to each other, but to Odin, Thor, and Freya. Food was thus turned into a weapon of morale, giving warriors the sense that divine power flowed with every bite. On long campaigns, meals before combat could be Spartan to the point of discomfort. Accounts from Frankish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe Vikings surviving on dried fish, hard bread, and water before launching sudden attacks. Hunger sharpened aggression. To march lean and strike fast was often more effective than waiting for comfort. In this way, deprivation itself became a kind of preparation. After battle, however, everything changed. The Feast of Victory was one of the most important moments in Viking culture. When warriors returned, whether from a raid abroad or a skirmish at home, the distribution of food marked the order of honor. The best cuts of meat went to leaders and champions, while lesser portions went to ordinary fighters. Ale and mead flowed freely. These meals were not just about replacing lost energy, but about affirming hierarchy and rewarding bravery. Animal bones unearthed in Viking camps, sometimes charred, sometimes split for marrow, show that cattle, pigs, and sheep were slaughtered after battles when supplies allowed. In foreign lands, raids provided immediate bounty, livestock, grain, or wine, seized from villages and monasteries. To eat the food of the defeated was a statement of dominance, turning sustenance into a visible trophy of conquest. The contrast between meals before and after combat was deliberate. Where pre-battle meals were light and controlled, post-battle feasts were loud and abundant. The shift mirrored the Viking view of life itself: restraint before struggle, release after triumph. These rhythms were essential in sustaining morale. A warrior who endured thin porridge in the morning could look forward to roasted meat by nightfall, if victory came. Not all post-battle meals were celebrations. Sometimes survival was the only prize. Defeated warriors might eat thinly from dwindling supplies, nursing wounds with broth and whey. Archaeological traces at battlefield sites suggest that improvised meals, boiled horse meat, wild plants, or anything at hand, sustained those who could not return home immediately. Hunger, again, became part of the story of battle, shaping who lived long enough to tell it. The sagas highlight these themes. In the saga of the Jomsvikings, warriors are described eating quietly before battle, steeling themselves. After victory, they are shown feasting gloriously, drinking until songs and boasts filled the hall. In defeat, they often hunger, captured, or driven to forage. These contrasts reinforce the lesson that food, like fate, followed the turn of fortune on the battlefield. There was also a psychological use of food in war. Leaders sometimes withheld feasts until after combat, promising rewards of meat and ale only if the men fought bravely. In this way, food was weaponized as motivation, binding survival to courage. The Jarl who could provide a victory feast kept loyalty. The one who failed risked losing followers. Food thus became a political tool, as important as silver or land. Battlefield diets also shaped the longer campaigns. In sieges, both attackers and defenders relied on dried fish, grains, and preserved meat. Chronicles of Viking attacks on Paris and London note the importance of supply lines, with ships carrying barrels of stockfish and salted meat. Without food, even the fiercest warriors could not hold a siege. Hunger could end campaigns as surely as swords. Even in combat, the Viking relationship with food remained one of extremes. They could starve on the march, then gorge in the aftermath. They could eat ritual meals that bound them to gods, then plunder food from foreign stores. Food was both fuel and symbol, something to endure, something to celebrate, something to display. To understand Viking battles, we must therefore look not only at their axes and shields, but also at their bowls and cups. Hunger steeled them, porridge sustained them, and feasts rewarded them. In the Viking world, combat was always accompanied by eating, whether sparingly or excessively. Their diet was as much a part of battle as their weapons. To the Vikings, food was never just nourishment. It carried meaning. shaping their view of gods, heroes, and the order of the world. In sagas and myths, meals were woven into the deepest structures of belief. Eating was tied to fate, to loyalty, and to the balance between life and death. To read their stories is to see how food became more than a necessity. It became a language. At the heart of this symbolic world lay the banquet halls of the gods. In Valhalla, the warriors chosen by Odin were promised endless feasting. Every day they fought, and every evening they sat to dine. Their meat came from Sarimnir, a boar that was slaughtered each night and reborn the next morning. Their drink was mead, flowing not from barrels but from the udders of a magical goat named Heithrun, who grazed on the leaves of the world tree. These images told the Vikings that in death, as in life, food was the bond between warriors and their lord. To feast eternally was to live forever in honor. The sagas also remind us that food could reveal character. Generosity in feasting marked a great leader. A jarl who offered guests roasted meat and full cups of ale was remembered as strong and noble. A miserly host, by contrast, was scorned. In Havamal, the collection of wisdom verses attributed to Odin, the proper treatment of guests is repeated often. Bread and ale were not simply kindness, but the foundation of reputation. Hospitality was a moral duty, and food was its proof. In myth, hunger often symbolized struggle. Giants, enemies of the gods, were sometimes described as ravenous eaters, devouring cattle and men alike. Their endless appetite represented chaos and imbalance. To feed without restraint was to embody destruction. By contrast, the gods, though they feasted, were measured in their consumption. Their meals reflected order, binding community, rather than tearing it apart. The balance between hunger and control was thus a symbol of cosmic harmony. Sacrificial feasts carried the deepest symbolic weight. In blot rituals, animals were offered to the gods, their blood sprinkled on statues, their meat consumed by the people. This act united humans and deities through shared sustenance. Food became a bridge, a visible sign of devotion. To eat the sacrificial meat was to participate in the sacred order, joining gods, ancestors, and kin in a single meal. The sagas also show food as a test of endurance and worth. Heroes were often depicted surviving on little, eating dried fish or rough bread while traveling. Their ability to endure hunger marked them as exceptional. By contrast, cowardly figures were sometimes mocked for their greed, described as overeating or hoarding food. What one ate, and how one ate, revealed the measure of the person. Even in family tales, food carried meaning. In Eagle's saga, banquets serve as moments of political negotiation, where loyalty is affirmed with gifts of food and drink. Inheritance disputes were often settled over shared meals. To refuse food at such moments was to refuse peace. To accept it was to bind oneself to obligation. The act of eating together became a contract, as binding as any oath. The connection between food and fate is perhaps clearest in the image of the Norns, the weavers of destiny. Though not depicted as cooks, their weaving was often described in terms of nourishment and cycles. Just as meals came and went, so too did life and death. Some scholars suggest that for the Norse, the rhythm of hunger and feasting mirrored the rhythm of fate itself, moments of plenty followed by moments of loss, endlessly turning. Symbolism also reached into the afterlife beyond Valhalla. In Hell, the realm of the dead who did not die in battle, food took on darker meanings. There, the giantess Hel presided over a hall where the plates were called hunger and the knives starvation. To eat in that place was to consume despair itself. Here, food was not reward but punishment, a reminder that not all endings were glorious. The imagery of food in sagas and myths reflected a society that lived with extremes. Hunger was never far away, and feasting was a moment of relief and celebration. By turning these realities into symbols, the Vikings made sense of the unpredictability of their world. Food became a mirror of power, character, and fate. In every layer of Norse thought, food was woven into meaning. To feast was to honor gods and kin. To endure hunger was to prove worth. To share food was to create bonds. To hoard or devour was to invite scorn. Even in death, Meals define destiny, eternal meat and mead for the chosen, hunger and despair for the forgotten. The Viking diet, therefore, was never only about survival. It was also about symbolism, myth, and identity. To eat was to live, but also to belong, to believe, and to become part of a larger story. To understand how the Vikings ate, we must look not only at their sagas and myths, but also at what remains in the ground. Archaeology gives us the quiet details: the hearthstones blackened with soot, the fragments of cooking pots, the bones discarded after meals. From these fragments, we can rebuild the kitchens of a Viking household, and through them, glimpse how meals were prepared, shared, and remembered. The Viking home was centered around the longhouse, a structure built of timber, turf, or stone, depending on the region. At its heart was the hearth, the fire that gave warmth, light, and food. Archaeological excavations from sites in Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and the British Isles show long central fireplaces, often lined with stone slabs running through the middle of the main hall. This was more than a cooking space, it was the core of family life. Around the hearth, cooking tools were simple yet effective. Iron cauldrons, sometimes suspended from hooks or chains, allowed stews to simmer over open flames. Clay and soapstone pots were used for boiling, their fragments found across Scandinavian settlements. Flat stones and iron griddles served for baking flatbreads, while wooden bowls and ladles, preserved in peat bogs, show the everyday utensils of a Viking kitchen. The fuel for cooking varied by location. In wooded regions, firewood was abundant, but in Iceland and Greenland, where forests were scarce, Vikings relied on turf, peat, and dried animal dung to keep fires burning. These fuels produced less heat than wood, shaping the kinds of meals possible. Stewing and boiling became more common than roasting, as they required longer, lower heat. Animal bones tell us much about Viking meals. Excavations often uncover remains of cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and fish. Cut marks on bones show where meat was butchered, while cracks suggest marrow was extracted. The presence of charred bones indicates roasting, while large piles of fish bones reveal drying or smoking for preservation. Archaeologists at sites like Hedeby and Jorvik have even identified imported bones and shells, suggesting that exotic foods, such as walnuts or oysters, sometimes appeared in Viking kitchens. Evidence of bread making appears in quernstones, used to grind barley and oats into flour. These heavy stones, worn smooth by centuries of grinding, show the labor involved in daily meals. The resulting flour was coarse, producing dense flatbreads. Traces of carbonized bread, discovered in hearth remains, confirm their importance. Combined with buttermilk or whey, such bread formed a staple part of the Viking diet. The layout of the longhouse also reflected the role of food. The hearth stood in the center, and around it, benches and platforms served for eating and sleeping. Smoke vented through holes in the roof, but much of it lingered, blackening the beams. This constant smoke helped preserve dried meat and fish hung overhead, turning the roof into a natural smokehouse. In this way, architecture and diet were intertwined. In larger settlements, specialized cooking areas appeared. Archaeologists at Borg and Lofoten, Norway, uncovered a great hall with multiple hearths, suggesting that cooking for feasts required separate fires. At trade towns like Birka and Hedeby, outdoor ovens and pits lined with stones show communal cooking on a larger scale. These were places where food was prepared not only for families, but for visitors, traders, and warriors. Excavated waste pits tell us about seasonality. Bones of young animals suggest spring slaughter, while preserved fish remains point to autumn catches. The presence of berries and nuts indicates seasonal gathering. These cycles match the agricultural calendar, with food preserved in summer and autumn to last through long winters. The kitchen was thus not only a place of daily cooking, but the heart of survival planning. The remains of drinking vessels also give us clues. Wooden cups, horn mugs, and glass beakers imported from the continent have been unearthed in graves and settlements. These vessels suggest that drink was as central as food. Ale and mead, brewed in farmsteads, were consumed from humble cups, while imported glass marked wealth and prestige. The act of drinking, like eating, carried social meaning. Grave finds offer perhaps the clearest view of food's role. In burials, especially of high-ranking individuals, cooking tools, cauldrons, and feasting gear were sometimes placed with the dead. In some graves, remains of food, meat, grains, or eggs were buried alongside, provisions for the journey to the afterlife. Kitchens and hearths then were not just about survival. They were tied to belief, identity, and memory. What emerges from archaeology is a picture of practical ingenuity. Viking kitchens were smoky, hot, and labor-intensive. Meals required constant tending, grinding, stirring, and storing. Women were central in this work, though men too played roles, especially in large feasts. The traces left behind, burnt stones, worn corn fragments, cracked bones, are small, but together they reveal the pulse of daily life. To stand at the remains of a Viking hearth is to stand where families once gathered, where warriors ate before voyages, where children learned the taste of porridge and fish. These kitchens, though humble, were the engines of survival. Their fires warmed the longhouse, preserved the catch, and held together the rhythms of Viking life.